This lecture is going to go over the argumentative mode, especially in regard to using the Toulmin model. So as always in our writing, we're going to look at OAS Standard 2. We're going to use a reading and writing process. And so all of the writing we do will have pre-writing components, procedural knowledge, and all of that attached to it. But especially with argumentative writing, it is in OAS Standard 3. Looking specifically at 12th grade, with argumentative writing, students need to be able to introduce precise, informed claims, distinguish them from alternative or opposing claims, organize their claims, their counterclaims, and evidence in a logical way, and then provide evidence to develop a balanced argument using credible sources. So that's the actual standard that we will be teaching our students and the one that we will be modeling as well throughout this essay. In addition, students need to use correct vocabulary, language, and all of that is included. And then what we're really going to focus on in a later essay is the blending of the modes in using narrative and informative to support our arguments. So that's a little bit of background on the standards. So first, I just want to go through a little bit of context about argument. We know it is part of critical thinking. In order to be a critical thinker, you must be able to identify arguments and make arguments to support your own beliefs or opinions. It is about making a case in support of a claim, and argument is everywhere. Argument happens every day. When we see argument or we hear argument, we need to be able to evaluate that, and that allows us to participate in a democratic society. Especially in the season of political debates, we need to be informed, educated citizens who can distinguish and evaluate the arguments. The difference between persuasive writing and argumentative writing is that balance of claim, evidence, warrant, backing, and rebuttal. Argument provides more of that rebuttal. And then we're going to specifically focus on the Toulmin model of argumentative writing because it provides a pretty clear structure on all of the components that make an argument effective. So the purpose, a little bit of background on Toulmin, it was created in 1958. It focuses on just being able to identify basic parts of an argument. Now, similar to learning the parts of speech, it might be important to be able to label those parts of speech, but rather it's important to be able to integrate that knowledge into your writing. So in this tutorial, we're going to focus on the identification of those Toulmin components, but the purpose and the overall goal is that transference of your knowledge that you will be able to implement them into your writing in order to be effective in writing argumentative essays. So we do this two ways. First, we need to identify and analyze sources, and then we need to be able to apply, test, and critique it in our own argument. So it works two ways, in the production and in the consumption of arguments, and that happens every day. So the structure of the Toulmin model covers 7 parts, and I actually created this graphic organizer based off what was in our Oh Yeah textbook, because I thought it was a really easy way to see how some of those parts have interplay and some of them are similar. I also included some of the synonyms for the words because just like the standards might have called it a counterclaim or a rebuttal, there are some synonyms that we need to know. So in this graphic organizer, I listed the AKAs so that if you know it as a different term, you'll be able to identify the purpose of that structure. I've given you kind of a brief summary here, and then some questions to ask yourself in order to identify the parts of the argument that you are either looking for or the parts that you are creating. So this graphic organizer is hopefully a really easy way for you to organize your notes, to give you critical questions, to guide you in your understanding of argumentative structure. So we will also look at this template, which puts all of kind of those argumentative elements into a sentence structure. So you can use those transitions and fill in the blank to create a really detailed summary of your argument. So let's practice a little bit. This guided practice comes from Kelly Gallagher, his book, In the Best Interest of Students. And so I want you to just pause this video, look at the narrative right here, and see if you can just visually identify the claim, evidence, warrant, backing, and rebuttals before we even get into those terms. So consider this a type of pre-assessment, and go ahead and hit pause and try to do it for yourself. All right, here is the answer key. So I went through and just used word comments to identify all of those components. So hopefully you were able to visually do that as well. But in this very brief, informal student example of argument, we were able to identify a claim, evidence, warrant, backing, and rebuttal. So even just in one paragraph, you should be able to have all of those components to make an effective argument. So let's look at each of those elements separately. So one is the issue, and this is pretty much your topic, the topic of your argument, and it might follow a problem and hopefully a solution format, but the issue is your topic. The claim, I think of it like a thesis statement. It's the statement that is being argued. This is what you want there to be resolution for, or this is the problem or the issue. This sometimes is the conclusion if you're looking for a solution. It works as a thesis statement. It's not a summary, but you do need to take a side or a stance or make a point on what side you are going to argue. It can arise from a question if it's going to be inquiry-based, but I think the easiest way to make an argument is to find a problem, make a claim about it, and then make sure you have enough evidence to support it. You do not want to make a claim that is based on opinion. That's more persuasive writing. If it cannot be proved, if it's too vague, or if it's overly generalized. So some questions to ask yourself as you are creating claims or trying to identify claims are here in blue. But the way that I would create a claim statement is to include a should or should not, the claim, and then because. If I can put my statement, my issue in that structure, then it is a pretty good, strong thesis statement about what I'm going to argue. Component 3 is qualifiers, and these are statements that might limit the argument, or it might give some conditions. It's either going to be explicitly stated or it's just implied, and this pretty much gives it a little bit of a narrow focus. So questions to consider when identifying or creating qualifiers are: how can you limit the scope of the argument, or how much do you need to qualify your claim as its own dependent thought? Component 4 is the evidence, also known as data, and this has a lot of different synonyms: proof, grounds, facts, support. So evidence is kind of that all-encompassing term, and it has to have evidence. Your argument must have evidence because that's how your argument is valid. This is when research comes into play because you use that research to support the point that you're trying to make. Again, here are some questions that you can look at to address or identify the evidence in your own argument or in others. Component 5 is warrant, and these are often the hypothetical or the logical statements that are the bridge. And I think warrants are some of the hardest parts of the Toulmin model because it is that bridge between the claim and the data or the evidence. I think of these as kind of those transition pieces of information that get you from point A to point B. They might be the commonly accepted beliefs, the assumptions, the values that you hope your audience shares. It connects the claim to the data. It's often backed by facts. And it's kind of important to explain the why the evidence supports the claim. So it might have a little bit of analysis to it where you are giving your own interpretation and understanding of how the claim and the evidence are connected. In blue, here are some questions that you can ask to help you identify or create warrants. Component 6 is the backing, and these support the warrant. So you must have the backing to support the warrant. These give the substance to the warrant. These often are explicit, and this is where you might kind of give more clarity in your definition, clear up any misconceptions. And again, here are questions that you can ask yourself to better create and identify. And then the seventh and the last component is to look at rebuttals. These are also maybe known as qualifications or counterclaims, but these are the things that you want to consider, the objections that other people might make. It shows that you are a well thought out argumenter, if that's a word, if you are able to address the counter or the opposing views. So in preparing the rebuttals, you often want to think about what are all of the exceptions, what are all the loopholes, what are all the things that people are going to throw at you that you need to be prepared for. If you've taken debate, then you know that you need to be prepared for both sides of the argument. So this is where your argument becomes that balanced, has that balanced approach to it. You must qualify everything that you write. And then here are some keywords to help you with rebuttals. So let's do a little bit of practice. Hopefully you printed off this template that I showed you. My examples are actually going to be on an older version, but I want you to follow along and fill in this component. On the second page, you have that structure that I showed you earlier to help you write very clear, detailed summary statements. So the first one that we're going to look at is the issue is old cars, and it comes from this YouTube video. So I'll pause this so that you have a chance to watch that video on your own. So go ahead and pause and click this link. Or actually, let me see if I can just pull it up here. I'll just watch.
Welcome to the tutorial on using the Toulmin model of argumentation to analyze and create arguments in discussion and writing. The Toulmin model is named for the British logician and philosopher Stephen Toulmin, who created this organizational scheme to use for understanding and creating arguments that can be applied to real-world situations instead of the syllogistic black and white scenarios usually presented in philosophy classes. His most famous work, where he put forward the Toulmin model, is a book called The Uses of Argument. The Toulmin model breaks arguments down into 6 essential parts, which all interact and depend on each other to form a complete argument. To understand this model as a system of argumentation, it is important to have a good understanding of each component part on its own. First, the claim is the main point you hope to put forth in your argument. It is ultimately what you're trying to convince your audience to think or agree with. Second, the evidence is the information that you use to support and explain your claim. The evidence tells us why the claim is valid. Third is the warrant, which is one of the most important contributions of Toulmin's scheme to our conception of argumentation. The warrant helps us draw connections between the claim and the evidence. The warrant identifies assumptions that not everyone may share and that often go unspoken in arguments. Similar to the evidence, the backing provides support for the warrant. It tells us why our warrant is a rational assumption. Fifth, rebuttals are potential objections to your claim, which are necessary to include according to Toulmin because they make your argument more nuanced and complete, as they demonstrate that you are aware of and have considered oppositions to your perspective. Finally, qualifiers allow you to adjust and add specificity and nuance to your claim, thereby making it more stable and less susceptible to further rebuttals. The first 3 parts, the claim, evidence, and warrant, are the primary components of the model, and the second 3 parts, the backing, rebuttal, and qualifier, are the secondary components because they supplement the primary ones. The Toulmin model is often represented visually in this way in order to illustrate how each of the 6 elements relates to and depends on each other. As you can see, the warrant sits between the evidence and the claim, but is put in parentheses because the warrant in many arguments is often left as an unstated assumption instead of being explicitly drawn out. Here we have a sample argument put into the scheme. You can see that our claim is that cars over 20 years old shouldn't be allowed on the road, and our evidence for why this is the case is because older cars pollute more and are less safe than new cars. The warrant, or assumption that ties our claim and evidence together, is that removing older cars would result in a cleaner environment and fewer accident-related injuries and deaths. While this warrant may be pretty obvious and thus not necessary to spell out in this argument, this is not the case for every other argument or warrant. In this example, our rebuttal is that not all older cars bear the same responsibility for pollution and danger, so we can qualify our claim to take this rebuttal into account by allowing that some older cars may be acceptable and that putting limitations of use on old cars may be more reasonable than completely disallowing their use. Notice especially that if this were an argument being made for an academic essay, the warrant and the backing would be the primary source of discussion because these are the parts of the model that most depend on factual or hard data. So these would be the places where researched information could be used to support this argument. Essentially, these are the aspects of the Toulmin model that make your argument for you and that they hold up your claim and evidence against scrutiny. Without these aspects, you force your audience to connect these dots for you. The Toulmin model helps in the composition of arguments for these reasons. It asks you to think beyond, above, below, and against your own argument. That is, you cannot have completely employed the Toulmin model for your argument without putting your own claims to the test first. Furthermore, since the scheme is built upon an inherently logical structure of rational questioning, you can be sure that your argument uses reason, if sometimes even to analyze irrational situations. The Toulmin model is just as useful for analyzing arguments made by others as it is for creating them yourself. For instance, look at this advertisement here for a 1967 Ford Mustang. If we can determine the answers to these 6 questions, that is, if we can fill in the Toulmin model, we will know a lot about how this argument has been built, both in terms of its successes and its faults. In this example, where would the boxing glove image and phrase, "strike a blow," fall into the Toulmin scheme? If it is evidence, what warrant connects it to the primary claim of the ad, which we can assume is buy a Mustang, or at least think about buying a Mustang?
So I will stop there, but just to show you in somebody else's perspective how these components all have that interplay and that exchange with each other. This is my example of that same argument as I mapped it out. And so using that kind of because statement structure, because cars older than 20 years pollute the environment and are not as safe as newer cars, they should not be allowed on the road, or they should at least be given limited access on account of the amount of greenhouse gases they emit and more life-threatening accidents they cause, unless the older cars are considered classics and only driven on special occasions. Now, that's a very complex sentence, but it's just an easy way to show how this structure can be organized into a very concise argument that includes all of the different parts. So another guided practice is the issue, smoking in public places. So I've gone through and given you a narrative and identified the components in blue so that you can see how they work within the text. And again, here is my graphic organizer of how I filled that out. So if you will go through and pause this and fill out the graphic organizer on your own, that way you have that example of labeling everything and finding and identifying each of those components. So go ahead and click pause. Okay, so the last part is to do independent practice, where you get to implement these components and knowledge on your own. So if you go to this website, Room for Debate, it has a list of lots of different issues. And so you can click on an issue. I'll do the Trump one. And once you look at the issue, you are given different sides to it, and you'll have different debaters. So this one has 2 different sides. So we have an article, and then you'll have a response, and then you might have another article, and they go back and forth. What's great about this is that you can make an outline of the argument and see some of the rebuttals that the 2 or 3 or 4 different debaters had. So I want you to go through and find an issue and read the articles and then create an outline of the Toulmin model by identifying each of those different components. You can either do it on your graphic organizer or do it in outline form, but go ahead and add that to the argumentative discussion. And this will be great practice for you in identifying so that you will also be able to create and use in your own writing. So that is a tutorial on the Toulmin model. You have a lot more information in your book, Oh Yeah, especially chapter 5. So make sure you also do that critical reading in order to enhance your procedural knowledge.